So I am going to speak on the value of complexity for working with particularly intractable social problems. So this is something that I've studied for about 20 years now, which are very difficult long-term social problems. These are the kinds of things that wear on, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, generations. They resist everybody's good faith attempt at working them out. And people, even though they get exhausted and fed up and really want to quit, sometimes these problems become bigger than us, and we nevertheless sort of have to suffer through them. So these kinds of problems happen in family feuds. So I know many of you here, and I know your families, and I know they've happened to you, and they've happened to me. My children are here, they can attest to this, that there are these dynamics that happen that just start to take on a life of their own. So they can happen at that level. They can certainly happen between political parties, red voters and blue voters, or as we've seen in Washington, D.C., where politics are more polarized today than they have ever been before in the history of this country, where voting is almost in complete opposition. So those kinds of dynamics that sometimes last, in that case, 30 or 40 years, chronic patterns of urban violence or pockets of extreme poverty, which again just resist all of our best laid plans to address them, or protracted wars such as Israel-Palestine, Sudan, Syria now. So these are all intractable problems. And there's something that Karl Popper, who was one of the last century's best science philosophers, called cloud problems. He said that the world can be sort of separated into two types of problems. You have clock problems and you have cloud problems. Clock problems are those that you can kind of take apart and look at pieces of them and understand where the kind of problem is in a piece, and then sort of put things back together. And that's one type of problem that we face in science and practice. But cloud problems are different. They have a different kind of logic. The cloud problems are those kinds of living, acting things that have many pieces that are affecting each other in weird ways, and they somehow come together and create a pattern which cannot be taken apart. We can't understand them by their pieces. We have to somehow understand them as a whole. And so for those problems, this is what I want to speak to. In my 10 minutes of fame here, I want to talk about the importance of making them more complex, or understanding of them much more complex, in order to address them. So the case I'll talk about is our neighbors. 2 blocks in this direction is Harlem, which, as you know, since the turn of the last century has been the epicenter of African-American culture and business, and has been a oftentimes thriving residential community. In the 20s and 30s, there was something called the Harlem Renaissance, which was this great time of new art and new music coming from Harlem. So it's an extraordinary neighborhood, great restaurants. But in the 1970s, it had hit a serious decline. And about 2/3 of the population at the time were living below the poverty line. Crime was on the rise in all of New York City. So violent crime had spiked from the early 60s up until 1990, robbery, aggravated assault, and it was nowhere worse than it was in Harlem. And at this time, you see more and more men of color, black men, 1 in 3 in prison, Latino, 1 in 6. So you see this accumulating approach to incarceration of young black men, and this startling trend of more and more youth held in adult prisons and jails, which again, here you see a trend from about 85 to 97, but this trend again started at about that time. So this is the context of Harlem 1970, 1980, where this young man, a guy named Jeffrey Canada, comes up. He's born in the South Bronx. He's born to a single mother. She works menial jobs, sometimes relies on welfare to get by. And Jeff is something of a self-described punk. Hangs out with the boys, drinks, gets in some fights, smokes some weed, has a good time on the streets, carries a knife, and experiences that his neighborhood becomes more and more dangerous and more violent as drugs and gangs and more weapons come into the neighborhood. And so he experiences this change over time but somehow manages to stay in school, gets a scholarship to a good college, then goes on to Harvard Graduate School, and focuses a lot of his energy on his taekwondo and earns a third-degree black belt. And so about this time, he's particularly interested in coming back to Harlem and helping what he calls my kids, kids like him, kids that were born without privilege, with few opportunities, who are really on that tipping point of falling off and dying at early ages or making it. So he really comes back with energy to help those kids. So in about 1990, Jeff becomes the president of the Reedland Centers for Children and Family Services in Harlem. And his objective here is again, to help these kids, and particularly to help young black men survive, right? Because at this point, the statistics were alarming. They were either going to jail or dying at early ages. And he really wanted to focus his energy on that population. And so one of the things he did, which is this very creative, sort of brilliant strategy, was to create a program which combined conflict resolution and martial arts, the sort of discipline and strength and security that comes from martial arts, with sort of strategies for negotiation, and to train these young men so that they can navigate their environment better. He runs this program for 2 or 3 years. Ideally feels very positive about it, and then ultimately believe that it fails, right? That it really doesn't have the kind of impact he wanted it to have, that focusing on the kids and helping them was insufficient to changing this pattern, this intractable pattern of violence and poverty that the kids were living in. So he really had to, at that point, stop, back up, and radically reevaluate how he thought about this change process that he was that he had embarked on, and to try to understand the broader system in which he worked. And so he started to think about the problem more like this, right? So this is sort of the type of factors that research tells us contribute to these kinds of long-term chronic patterns of violence and poverty in poor neighborhoods. Everything from macro poverty issues and insufficient access to health care and nutrition, the fact that you're all night long in an emergency room with your siblings because that's where you used to get medical care, and so you're not sleeping at night, and the fact that children that are exposed to lead paint early on have much poorer impulse control. So when people get in their face, they're much likely to strike out, be identified as violent and a bully, and that starts a process. So all of these things in this cloud of factors work together to create the patterns of violence. And what Jeff started to realize is that helping these kids and giving them training in conflict resolution and martial arts was a drop in the bucket. It was insufficient to trying to think about a problem like this that is truly a cloud problem, right? So it's with that kind of more complexification of his understanding, more nuance of his understanding of the situation, that he backed up and created what he called, at that point, the Harlem Children's Zone. So this was a kind of radical social experiment. It still is a social experiment that is about 10, 12 years in the making. And it is an attempt to work with originally 24 square blocks in Harlem, and then 60, and then 100 square blocks in Harlem. It's sort of this area in Harlem, where he is attempting to understand the patterns of violence and poverty and conflict that's multi-causal, and then with that kind of understanding, focus in and do something different. And so what they do in the zone is they focus on the ones and the twos. So in New York City, when your child is ready to go to school, they test the kids, and they give them reading tests and school readiness tests. And you can score a 1, 2, 3, or 4s. And the 3 or 4s usually make it. They usually do okay. They have enough support to make it through at least most of school. But the 1s and 2s don't. The 1s and 2s have a much harder time. They get sucked into, they drop out, they get sucked into gangs, they get sucked into problems. And so it's really the focus on the 1s and 2s that Jeff wanted to begin to work with this theory of change. He believed that if in Harlem he could help the most at-risk kids and help them really from birth through college at this point, sort of supporting them all the way through graduation in high school and then with some support through college, that would float the community, that would change this kind of radical pattern and in a way addressing everything. So what they do is they provide these kids and other kids in the zone with education, social, and medical services combined. And they do it as only community activists can do it. They're tenacious. They triage each kid. They understand the kid. They understand the family dynamics. And they give that family what they need to get the kid into school, to survive, to thrive, and to make it to college and move on. And so the theory of change he has is complex, and the services they offer are complex, but it's also focused on the most vulnerable kids, right? And so the outcomes have been pretty promising. This is Promise Academy, which is their charter school that they've opened several years ago. They're in all of the public schools within the zone as well, offering support to parents and principals and teachers there. And the outcomes thus far have been very promising. 100% of the kids in the preschool are ready for school once they enter the school system. The Promise Academy has been rated 99th percentile in city high schools. All of the kids last year in their program went on to secondary school, and over 4,000 parents have been trained in their baby college, which is sort of a parenting school. And the scores have been great. The change has been radical from the beginning of this to today. It's not perhaps coincidence that violence has also decreased radically in Harlem and in New York City since then. Now, I'm not suggesting that what Jeff did in Harlem and what the zone has done has changed the pattern of violence in New York City, because this pattern is seen elsewhere. It's been particularly stark or dramatic in New York City, the decline in violence, but it is multi-causal. And certainly the pattern of crime in Harlem to some degree continues and shows some spikes. But overall, the trends have been extremely promising. The local trends on the kids themselves and then the trends around crime and violence have been extremely promising. Now, what's most important for tonight's talk is not necessarily the zone and this approach, because it's not without criticism. Jeff and his approach has angered the unions to some degree because he requires things of teachers and staff that unions are not comfortable with. There have been problems, and it's a very expensive program. It takes a lot of money to give these kids the kinds of support they need to make it all the way out. And it's a long-term program. They say themselves that it's an experiment, and the trends are promising, and the benchmarks they've hit are very promising, but they don't know for sure whether it will have the kind of communal impact that they hope it will have. But it is an illustration of a principle, of an idea, that when we enter into trying to understand and deal with complex, difficult, multiply determined problems, that we really need to back up. We need to resist the temptation to go in and do what we think we've seen work elsewhere, or we've been trained to do and understand a certain thing, and to go for quick wins. And we really need to have a more nuanced understanding of what the problems are, what are existing programs that are there, and given that more nuanced understanding, maybe we go in, as Jeff did, in a different way. And this is what we do in conflict analysis these days, is when we face a conflict and we see that there are certain issues that have arisen and that seem to be kind of feeding each other, what we recommend is that people back up and understand the context of forces, the constellation of factors that are affecting those patterns. And with this kind of understanding, then perhaps you go in and work in a different way than you would have initially with whatever presented itself. So this is affecting how we approach conflict analysis and work, how we think about sustainable peace. And it's frankly an idea that's pretty pervasive in science. The idea that, for example, in decision making, when you face new problems, that you understand that problem in a complex way from different perspectives before you make a choice and work. And then once you make that choice, you evaluate its impact in a more complex and nuanced way before you act again, and then go back in. That kind of making things more complex before you focus and act has been shown to be a preferable and beneficial way of thinking for politicians and problem solvers in the lab and in politics. So this type of idea of the importance of complexity is across levels, all the way to the societal level. There's been interesting research looking at communities that have more complex social structures, where groups, members of different ethnic groups, play together and learn together and work together and organize politically together across ethnic lines. And in those more nuanced and complex structured societies, you see less violence, you see less inter-ethnic violence, right? So it's basically the same idea. That's what we call fractal. It's an idea that happens at different levels. So this is what I'm going to leave you with, is this idea that complexity before simplicity rules. Complexity in and of itself is insufficient, it's overwhelming, it's too much, but the importance of taking the time to understand the context, the nuance, before we go in and work is a critical step, and it's something that I think our speakers tonight will come back to more and more. Thank you.